Design is everything. That's a statement that's truer in today's world more than ever before. Our entire world is based on how things look. If things aren't aesthetic enough, they're not going to make an impact. Now, while the top dogs in the design world might be able to whip out their Photoshop skills and make anything look aesthetically pleasing, most people aren't that gifted in the design department. For them, Figma has been the guiding light and, well, in that process, became a $20 billion company. In this video, we're going to take you along Dylan's journey from taking Figma from a little startup to one of the biggest names in the world. In 2012, Dylan Field and Evan Wallace were studying at Brown University when they began talking about how complicated it was for the not gifted to design just about anything. So they thought, why not fix the problem? And with that came the very first version of Figma. They created a WebGL design platform that had easy, simple tools that would allow the user to design just about anything. The very first usable version started out on December 3rd, 2015, and anyone who had the invite to join the platform could use it to design their heart out. As some key invite-only members of their circle began using the platform, they would give their feedback, and with it, they began working out the kinks in the system and made the platform more and more stable. Now, this doesn't mean that they didn't hit any roadblocks along the way. Dylan had to take time off from Brown to continue working on the company, and in the initial phases, they were working on creating an easy-to-use meme generator that anyone could use to create memes that were ready to post soon after. While that all sounds fun, they also started to question their own work at that point. It became a will we ever make a difference type of deal. They didn't want to spend years building something that wouldn't amount to any meaning. It got to the point that they even thought about quitting because they simply couldn't figure out if the company would ever get to a point that they wanted it to. Generally, when you get to a point like this, you try to expand just a little bit. So Evan and Dylan did the same thing. They began hiring some people in the office, but even that, without direction, didn't end up going too well. They were hiring the wrong people, and when they weren't, they were micromanaging the right people so much that the person didn't have room to grow themselves. It was just one wrong move after another, and it all led to a breaking point. Dylan thought they'd have to shut the company down because he wasn't able to manage it the way he wanted. But then he made an executive decision and hired a manager to help him figure out the things that he was simply not great at the time. That became the turning point that the company needed to get back to that help those designers that can't do it themselves thing, and with it, it changed everything. Just a side note, we at iwdagency.com help small businesses take their projects from ideas to success too. We've got years of experience and knowledge that can take your e-commerce projects to new heights. Check us out at iwdagency.com to learn more. Alright, now back to Figma. After Dylan and Evan got a hand in the management department, things began to streamline almost immediately. They were able to take their focus from running the day-to-day things to making the big decisions, and one of the best ones they made was to go public. In September of 2016, the company went public, and subsequently in 2019, they released Figma Community. Figma Community allowed users to create designs and publish them on the community pages if they wanted to. Other users could then take that design as a template, play around with it, and create something totally different. It was the perfect starting ground for people who either wanted a tool that they could use to collaborate with their teams and build something together without having to be on a custom network or share an office computer, and for people who just needed someone to get the building blocks done for them so they could expand on the design process. The tool put people who were good at creating beautiful designs for websites and apps right there with people who were just starting out. It began helping the underdogs learn and the experts streamline their work too. This was a big realization. Figma had officially become a tool that didn't just appeal to the underdogs, but to those who knew what they were doing too. That's something that can be pretty hard to achieve, and for them to do that meant that they were on the path to greatness. They just had to figure out how to get there. For the next 2 years, Dylan and Evan offered the platform to anyone who wanted to use it for free. Even though they had been working on it for years at that point, they knew that they needed to get things just right before they could move on to monetizing the platform. If they monetized it before it was ready, they might just lose out on the majority of their users. But being free couldn't be the reason people wanted to use Figma. It needed to be so good that they'd abandon the harder to use tools like Photoshop and want to make the switch to Figma. That battle can be extremely difficult to win. Well, on your own anyway. So they just kept their growth model the same. They'd use their own ideas and vision, but work out the issues and grow using the feedback that users would provide. It allowed the platform to grow in a steady way and made it so everyone who was using it was a part of the bigger picture. This was incredibly useful because one person might notice a need for something that another would be totally oblivious to. It was a truly collaborative tool for everyone, something that the bigger companies like Adobe never really wanted to be. When you're in the same pool with the biggest names in the world, you have to find something that sets you apart. And for Figma, it was that collaborative nature that did it. So they just kept believing in themselves and going ahead with it. Although Dylan, like any other CEO, wanted his company to start making money as soon as possible, he also knew that if you were to do things too fast for your own journey, you might put yourself at risk for failure. So he went through the painstaking journey of raising capital to keep the platform growing while it was still free, being rejected by most firms several times over. But despite all of it, he didn't give up and kept going until he felt confident in Figma enough to start charging. Going from a free platform to a paid one can be a dangerous thing to do. When consumers are so used to using all the features for free, they can be put off by suddenly having to pay for those same services, unless your product or service is so great that they think it would be worth it to pay for it. The pandemic actually worked in Figma's favor in a way. It allowed people who never even thought about designing their own apps to be able to do it entirely with a few clicks. Working from home using a platform that was stable and had been there for years just made people flock to Figma. This was a time when design mattered even more than ever before because people were quarantined. They were stuck in their homes, and the need for visually appealing, engaging design was clear. You either had to be a design genius to get there, or take help from a platform like Figma to make it happen. Most people chose the latter, and with it, Figma grew bigger than ever, and it was time to think about monetizing the platform. From the outset, Figma's journey from inception to monetization seems far too slow. They started off in 2012 and didn't get to thinking about actually starting to charge until 2021. But in hindsight, it allowed them to grow the right way, to create something that was organically bringing more and more users in. While massive softwares like Photoshop did continue to grow throughout this time, they don't have that personal touch that Figma does. So despite Figma and Photoshop technically having totally different target markets, Figma became a threat to Adobe. This wasn't really something Dylan and Evan set out to do. No one willingly rattled the big guy's cage like that. However, with time, the way the company grew, it was obvious that one day it had the potential to stand right next to Photoshop and have the people divided about the approach they wanted to take with their own design journey. That possibility alone was enough to make Figma stand out to Adobe. At this point, Adobe could have done things two ways. The first would be to launch their own version of Figma. Not exactly a copy, but to add features in the Adobe space that would pull people from Figma to Adobe. When the little guy didn't have that many people using the platform anymore, they'd have to ultimately shut down. With it gone, they could go right back to business, and the potential threat would be eliminated too. But the thing is, with companies that big, they don't really need to go that route. Why would they go on to spend decades in research to create a rival for a company that isn't even technically a direct threat? The kinks that are found in the early phases of a company are usually too time-consuming and labor-intensive to fix. All of that just doesn't sound like a good enough idea for a giant like Adobe to go through. But at the same time, they couldn't just let Figma get bigger and bigger and continue to capture that market that they could potentially want to aim for in the future, could they? Not quite. So they got to work. In April 2020, Figma was valued at $2 billion. That was a massive growth milestone for Figma, considering it started off with absolutely nothing. Even at that point, it wasn't big enough to be an issue for Adobe, but companies like that don't just wait around for others to become issues. They get things sorted out before any of that happens. So what did get things sorted out mean in this situation? Well, it meant that Adobe had to do something to stop Dylan and his company from getting bigger and possibly encroaching into the market that was thus far dominated by Adobe. If Adobe just swept in and shut down Figma, it would just create a vacuum in the market. Soon after, someone else would create another version of Figma that they'd have to go after next. It's a model that simply doesn't work. The thing is, in business, you need to know how to do things in a way that will actually benefit you in the long run. So they decided that it would be best to take over Figma as it was. Now, Dylan had taken the company from the literal ground up. Plus, he'd just gotten the company valued at $2 billion, so he knew that it was going to be a steady journey up from there. So how do you get a CEO who knows what he's destined for to just give up his company? You offer him 10 times the value of his company. Yeah, Adobe offered Dylan a $20 billion deal. And even though the decision was a difficult one, considering Figma stood for pretty much everything that Adobe didn't, it was an offer that was far too good to refuse. So Dylan went for it. In the deal, he alone made $1 billion for himself after putting in a decade's worth of work into the company. When you take a look at the bigger picture, future, sure, Figma might make several times that amount in the future, but to pocket an entire billion after starting a project on a whim is not that bad at all, right? Now, of course, the acquisition of Figma does stir up some very important questions too because of the polar opposites the two companies are. People are wondering what the future of the company will look like. The employees who've worked at Figma all these years are used to a pretty relaxed, chilled out way of working, as the case is with most startups. Now, being a part of a massive name like Adobe will ultimately mean that the leadership and the goals change as time goes on. It's a change that's usually inevitable. It's extremely difficult to maintain the same work environment and allow the employees the same freedoms that helped grow the company. Employees usually end up quitting and are replaced by people who match the new vision under new leadership. However, it's not necessary that Figma will go that way. Dylan has been allowed to stay on board as the CEO, and for the time being, it seems like things will go on exactly the way they were before, just with the CEO now being a billionaire. But who knows if he'll be able to keep the same control and maintain the environment that Figma got to this point, or will it eventually turn into just another overpriced product by Adobe, the very thing Dylan set out not to do? I guess we'll just have to wait and find out. And on that note, we're going to wrap up today's video. What did you think about Figma's incredible journey to success? Let us know in the comments below, and if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this one. If you want to grow your own e-commerce business, check us out at iwdagency.com and start your journey to success today. We'll see you next time.